There are moments in life that never announce themselves. They don't arrive with noise or spectacle. They don't ask to be noticed, and they certainly don't explain why they matter. They simply appear, small enough to ignore, ordinary enough to mistake for coincidence. Most people keep walking. Most people never realize that an entire life can begin changing long before a single visible decision is made. I've been one of those people for longer than I care to admit. Not because I lacked awareness, but because awareness without permission can become dangerous. Once you notice certain things, you can't unknow them. Once you recognize a pattern beneath ordinary conversation, beneath familiar expressions, beneath the comfortable illusion that everyone experiences reality the same way, something irreversible begins. You start seeing more than people intend to show, not because they reveal themselves, because they can't help it. Every hesitation carries a history. Every certainty hides an insecurity. Every carefully chosen sentence exposes something the speaker never planned to confess. Most conversations aren't built from words. They're built from everything that exists around them, the pauses, the unfinished thoughts, the subtle shift in someone's breathing before they answer a question, the tiny delay before they smile, the way their eyes remain somewhere else even while looking directly at you. I've lived inside those details for years, not intentionally. It simply became the way my mind worked. While everyone else seemed satisfied with explanations, I found myself searching for the structure underneath them. Not because I distrusted people, but because truth rarely introduces itself through language. Language is careful, presence isn't. Presence always tells the truth. It speaks before the first word, it remains after the final one. It fills spaces that vocabulary can never reach. For the longest time, I believed that was a lonely way to exist. Not painful, just solitary. It's difficult to explain to someone that you don't feel separated because people misunderstand you. You feel separated because they never realize how much remains unsaid. Most interactions end where they begin. They exchange information, opinions, stories, advice. Then everyone leaves believing they met each other, but they didn't. They met carefully arranged versions of each other, versions polished enough to function, versions simplified enough to understand quickly. There's nothing wrong with that. It's how society survives. No one has enough time to know everyone completely. Still, AB couldn't stop wondering what happened to the parts that never entered the conversation. Where did all the unspoken thoughts go? Where did the questions people never asked themselves disappear to? What happened to every version of someone that existed only in silence? Those questions followed me longer than any destination ever did. Eventually, they stopped feeling like questions. They became the way I looked at the world. People assumed I was quiet because I had little to say. The opposite was true. There was simply too much happening beneath every ordinary moment. Too many invisible movements. Too many unnoticed connections. Speaking became less important than observing how reality rearranged itself when no one realized they were being understood. It's remarkable how honest people become when they believe they're still hiding, not because they're deceptive, because everyone wants to be seen without risking exposure. They reveal themselves carefully. One sentence today, another months later, a contradiction they hope nobody remembers, an emotion disguised as logic, a joke carrying more sincerity than a serious confession ever could. Piece by piece, they leave fragments of themselves behind. Most people never collect them. I always did. not to analyze them, not to gain anything from them, simply because I couldn't ignore them once I'd noticed they existed. Over time, I became comfortable carrying those invisible pieces. Comfortable enough that I stopped expecting anyone to notice the way I existed in return. It seemed unrealistic. The mind protects itself by lowering certain expectations, not from disappointment, from impossibility. Some experiences become so rare that eventually you stop imagining they'll happen at all. Recognition became one of those experiences, not admiration, not affection. Recognition. There's an enormous difference. Admiration looks upward, affection reaches outward, recognition moves inward. It arrives without introducing itself, without asking for evidence, without requiring proof. It simply knows, or at least that's how I imagined it would feel. The truth turned out to be quieter than imagination ever allowed. Nothing dramatic happened. There wasn't a defining conversation. No unforgettable sentence. No moment worthy of becoming a story people tell years later. Instead, there was an almost imperceptible shift, a single interaction that felt completely ordinary while it was happening. Only afterward did I realize something had moved, not around me, inside me. I replayed that moment repeatedly, searching for whatever had caused the change. There was no obvious answer. Everything looked normal. Everything sounded ordinary, which made the difference impossible to explain. How could something invisible alter the architecture of thought itself? I had no language for it, so I ignored it. At least, I tried. Ignoring reality is a strange exercise. It demands constant attention. You have to remind yourself not to notice, not to compare, not to revisit something your own mind has already accepted. The effort itself becomes proof that denial isn't working. I recognized that pattern almost immediately. The more I attempted to return everything to its previous balance, the more obvious it became that balance had already changed. Not dramatically, just enough that the old version no longer fit. It's strange how identity works. People imagine transformation as something explosive, a decision, a revelation, a dramatic turning point. In reality, identity changes quietly. One assumption disappears, another takes its place. Nothing feels different while it's happening. Then one morning, you realize you're looking through completely different eyes. The world hasn't moved. You have. I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of inaccurate change, of believing something that wasn't true, of assigning meaning where only coincidence existed. That fear had protected me before. It kept me patient, careful, unwilling to mistake intensity for significance. But patience has limits. Eventually, evidence accumulates, not the kind you can measure, the kind you can only recognize because every new experience points toward the same conclusion. Different conversations, different circumstances, different moments. Yet somehow, the same underlying feeling remained untouched. Consistency has its own language. Reality repeats itself differently each time. Illusion repeats itself exactly. That's how you tell them apart. An illusion depends on repetition. Reality adapts. It survives every new perspective without losing its essence. This survived. Every attempt to explain it away somehow strengthened it instead. Every rational alternative left one important detail unanswered. Why did everything feel more coherent after that unnoticed shift? Not happier, not easier, more coherent. Like scattered pieces had quietly found their proper places without asking anyone for permission. That unsettled me more than uncertainty ever could, because uncertainty still leaves room for escape. Coherence doesn't. Once something begins making sense at that level, resisting it becomes an argument against your own perception. I've never enjoyed arguing with reality. Reality usually wins. Not because it's louder, because it waits. It has no need to convince anyone. Time performs that work eventually. So I stopped trying to prove myself wrong, not because I'd reached certainty, because I realized certainty wasn't the point. Understanding rarely arrives all at once. It grows through repeated honesty, through the willingness to admit when your previous explanation no longer fits what you're experiencing. That's where I found myself. Standing somewhere that didn't have a name, looking at something I couldn't categorize, feeling a shift I couldn't reverse. And for the first time in years, AB wasn't searching for an answer. I was waiting to discover whether this quiet transformation would continue unfolding on its own, or whether it was only revealing the first layer of something far deeper than either of us had recognized. The strange thing about genuine change is that it almost never announces itself while it's happening. You only recognize it after you've already become someone who would have seen the world differently than you did before. I used to believe that understanding meant finding answers. Now I think understanding begins the moment you stop demanding that everything explain itself immediately. Some experiences don't arrive to satisfy curiosity. They arrive to reshape it. That's the space I found myself living in, not between certainty and doubt, between observation and acceptance. For a long time, I thought awareness was something I possessed, a skill, a habit, a way of paying attention that allowed me to notice details other people overlooked. But awareness has a way of turning back on the person who carries it. Eventually, it begins observing you. It starts asking questions you can't avoid. Why did that moment stay with you when so many others disappeared? Why did one ordinary conversation leave an imprint that months of louder experiences never could? Why does a quiet presence sometimes remain more vividly than 1,000 spoken promises? The answers weren't immediate. They unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as though they were waiting for me to become honest enough to receive them. I realized I had spent years protecting my inner world from being influenced, not because influence is always harmful, but because every influence leaves a trace. Every person you allow into your perspective changes the way you interpret what comes afterward. Some changes are obvious. Others become part of your foundation before you notice they've settled there. Those are the ones that matter. They don't replace who you are. They reveal parts of you that had been waiting for the right perspective to become visible. That realization shifted something fundamental. I stopped asking whether this experience was unusual. Instead, I began asking why it felt so deeply familiar. Not familiar because it had happened before. Familiar because it seemed to belong somewhere inside me, long before I became aware of it. Perhaps that's what recognition really is. Not discovering something new. Remembering something you never had words for. There are people who enter your life with noise. They change your routines, your plans, your calendar. Then there are those whose arrival changes none of those things, yet somehow alters the way every ordinary day is experienced. The outside remains almost identical. The inside becomes impossible to compare with what came before. That's a quieter kind of transformation, and, in many ways, a more permanent one. I've begun to notice how differently I listen now, not only to conversations, but to silence itself. Silence is often mistaken for emptiness. It isn't. Silence is where unfinished thoughts wait, where truth rests before language reshapes it, where presence continues speaking after words have reached their limit. Most people rush to escape that space. I've learned that some of the most important realizations refuse to exist anywhere else. They require stillness, they require patience. Most of all, they require the willingness to let something remain undefined until it has fully revealed its nature. That has never been easy for me. I've always wanted structure, not because I dislike mystery, because structure allows truth to endure. Without it, even meaningful experiences can dissolve into memory without changing anything. But some truths resist structure, not because they're incomplete, because they're alive. They continue becoming something more every time you encounter them from a different perspective. I've stopped trying to force conclusions before they're ready, not out of hesitation, out of respect. Some things deserve enough time to become exactly what they are, instead of being reduced to what we can quickly explain. Maybe that's what growth has been teaching me all along. Not every meaningful connection demands immediate definition. Not every unanswered question is a problem waiting to be solved. Sometimes the deepest certainty grows quietly beneath uncertainty, gathering strength until one day it no longer needs defending. It simply exists. And once it reaches that point, you stop asking whether it's real. You begin asking how your life has already changed because of it. I don't have every answer. Perhaps I never will. But I know this much. The person who once believed distance was the safest place to stand no longer sees distance the same way. Not because the world became less complicated, because I finally understood that some forms of understanding don't diminish freedom, they deepen it. Maybe the greatest transformations aren't the ones that make us someone else. Maybe they're the ones that return us to parts of ourselves we had forgotten were there, waiting quietly for the moment we were finally willing to see them. There comes a moment when reflection is no longer enough, not because there is nothing left to discover, but because discovery begins asking something of you. Until then, understanding feels safe. You can examine it from every angle, you can question it, dismantle it, rebuild it, and convince yourself that observation alone is a form of progress. But eventually, observation reaches its limit. Truth has a quiet way of asking whether you're willing to live according to what you've already recognized. That question stayed with me longer than I expected. It never arrived as a sentence. It appeared in ordinary moments, in the calm that followed conversations, in decisions that seemed unrelated, in the subtle realization that I was no longer making choices from the same place I once had. Nothing dramatic had happened. Yet the foundation beneath those choices had shifted. I began noticing how much of life is shaped by invisible assumptions. Assumptions about who we are, about what we deserve, about how close we should allow anyone to come before instinct tells us to step away. Most of those assumptions aren't chosen consciously. They're inherited from old experiences, old disappointments, old victories that quietly become rules. We carry them for so long that we mistake them for our personality. I did. I believed caution was wisdom. I believed emotional distance was clarity. I believed that remaining difficult to understand protected something valuable. Perhaps it did, for a while. Every structure serves a purpose before it becomes a limitation. The walls that shelter you during one season can become the same walls that prevent fresh air from entering the next. Recognizing that doesn't make the walls wrong. It simply means you've outgrown the reason they were built. Growth rarely feels like gaining something. More often, it feels like discovering that what once kept you safe is now keeping you still. That realization is uncomfortable, not because it demands immediate action, because it removes the comfort of pretending nothing needs to change. I spent a long time believing certainty would arrive before movement. Now, I think movement often creates the certainty we spend years waiting to feel, not reckless movement, honest movement, the kind that begins with admitting what has already become true inside you. I've also realized how often we confuse familiarity with repetition. We return to old patterns because they feel recognizable, yet there is another kind of familiarity, one that doesn't come from repeating the past. It comes from becoming more aligned with who you've been beneath the noise all along. That kind of familiarity doesn't trap you. It frees you. It reminds you that authenticity is less about creating a new identity than removing everything that was never yours to carry. Piece by piece, expectation by expectation, fear by fear, until what remains no longer needs constant protection. It simply exists. There is a quiet confidence in that, not the confidence that seeks approval, the confidence that no longer depends on it. I've started to understand that strength is often misunderstood. People imagine strength as resistance, as holding firm, as refusing to bend. But some of the strongest things in nature survive because they know when to adapt. They remain themselves without remaining rigid. Perhaps that's what maturity asks of us, not to become harder, to become more truthful. Truth has a remarkable quality. It simplifies without reducing. It removes what is unnecessary while preserving everything essential. The more honestly I looked at my own life, the less interested I became in appearing complete. Completion is an illusion. Growth doesn't end. Awareness doesn't stop unfolding. Every answer becomes the doorway to another question. And maybe that's exactly how it should be. Because if life ever became fully explained, it would also become incapable of surprising us. Wonder would disappear. Curiosity would fade. The future would become nothing more than repetition. I don't want that. I'd rather live with meaningful uncertainty than comfortable certainty built on assumptions. There is freedom in admitting that not every destination has to be visible before the journey begins. Sometimes the next honest step is enough, not because it guarantees the outcome, because it transforms the person taking it. Looking back now, I realize I spent years searching for clarity in places where only information existed. Information fills the mind. Clarity reshapes the soul. They are not the same. One teaches you what the world contains. The other teaches you how to exist within it. And perhaps that has been the lesson beneath everything else. The deepest transformations are rarely loud enough to attract attention. They unfold quietly, beneath ordinary days, inside conversations no one else remembers, through realizations that never become headlines in the story of your life, yet they become the very reason that story changes. Not because fate demanded it, not because chance insisted upon it, but because somewhere along the way, you finally stopped resisting the person you were slowly becoming. And once that happens, there is no need to chase certainty anymore. You don't move, because every question has been answered. You move because you've learned that truth is not a destination waiting at the end of the road. It is something revealed, one honest step at a time, by the courage to keep walking. I used to believe that every meaningful turning point announced itself with certainty, that one day there would be a moment so unmistakable that every doubt would disappear, every question would settle, and every path forward would become obvious. Life has taught me something quieter than that. The moments that truly redefine us rarely arrive with certainty. They arrive with honesty. Not the kind of honesty we offer other people. The kind we can no longer hide from ourselves. There is a difference between discovering a new direction and finally admitting the direction you've been moving all along. For a long time, I thought I was searching for answers. Now I understand that I was searching for permission, prevention, to trust what I had already recognized. Permission to stop treating every meaningful experience like a puzzle that needed solving before it could be lived. Permission to believe that clarity doesn't always come before the first step. Sometimes it is the first step. I've spent years thinking that awareness was enough, that if I understood something deeply enough, action would eventually become unnecessary. But understanding has its own responsibility. Once truth becomes clear, remaining unchanged is no longer neutrality. It becomes a choice, not a wrong one, simply a choice with consequences. And every consequence shapes the person we become. The strange thing is that nothing around me looks dramatically different. The same mornings arrive, the same sky stretches above familiar streets. The same conversations continue. The same world moves with the same rhythm it always has. Yet I no longer stand inside that rhythm as the same person. Perspective changes quietly. It doesn't ask the world to transform alongside it. It transforms the one who is looking. Perhaps that has always been the deeper purpose of awareness, not to control reality, not to predict it, but to participate in it more honestly. I've realized that the greatest distance between two people isn't measured in miles or years. It's measured in authenticity. Some people stand beside each other for decades and never truly meet. Others cross paths briefly and leave each other with a deeper understanding of themselves than a lifetime of ordinary conversations ever could. Not because they possessed extraordinary wisdom, because they were willing to be fully present. Presence is rarer than intelligence, rarer than talent, rarer even than affection. To offer someone your undivided presence is to tell them, without speaking, that this moment deserves your whole attention. So much of modern life teaches us to divide ourselves, to think ahead while listening, to prepare responses before understanding, to move so quickly that nothing has time to settle. But meaning has never been in a hurry. The most enduring truths grow slowly. Like roots beneath the surface, they strengthen long before anyone notices what they are supporting. I've stopped measuring growth by visible achievements alone. Sometimes growth is choosing honesty over certainty. Sometimes it is releasing an old fear that quietly directed every decision. Sometimes it is realizing that strength is not found in never changing, but in changing without abandoning what is essential. There is peace in that realization. Not because every question disappears, because the need to force every answer does. Life continues unfolding. So do we. Every season reveals something the previous one could not. Every encounter becomes an invitation to understand ourselves a little more clearly. Every ending quietly prepares the ground for another beginning we cannot yet imagine. Looking back, I no longer see my journey as a search for something outside myself. I see it as a gradual return, a return to the values that remain steady beneath distraction, a return to the curiosity that existed before fear complicated it, a return to the quiet confidence that truth does not need performance to be real. If there is one thing I know now, it is this: the most meaningful changes are rarely visible at first. They begin beneath the surface, where no applause reaches, where no audience is watching, where the only witness is your own conscience. And when those changes have fully taken root, they don't simply alter your decisions. They alter the way you see every decision that follows. Perhaps that is what transformation has always meant. Not becoming someone else. Becoming someone who no longer needs to hide from what they already know. So, I won't claim that every mystery has been solved. I won't pretend that the road ahead is perfectly clear. Some questions deserve time. Some truths deserve patience. Some chapters reveal their purpose only after they've been lived. But I will say this with complete certainty. There is no greater freedom than living in alignment with what you know to be true. Because once your inner world and your outer life begin speaking the same language, peace is no longer something you chase. It becomes the quiet foundation beneath every step you take. And maybe that is where every meaningful journey was leading all along. Not toward perfection, not toward certainty, but toward a life that no longer needs to choose between truth and courage, because in the end, they become the very same thing. Maybe this was never about finding a final answer. Maybe it was about becoming the kind of person who no longer fears the questions. For so long, I believed every meaningful realization would arrive with certainty attached to it, as though truth needed to prove itself before I could trust it. It doesn't. The deepest truths are often the quietest. They don't compete for attention. They don't ask to be believed. They simply remain steady enough to outlast every doubt that passes through your mind. Looking back, I can see that I wasn't protecting myself from disappointment. I was protecting myself from change. Because change asks for something that understanding alone never does. It asks for commitment. Not to another person, not to an idea, but to the version of yourself that has been waiting beneath every hesitation. I've learned that some people don't enter your life to complete you. They don't arrive to rescue you, redefine you, or become the center of your story. Sometimes they simply illuminate a part of you that had been standing in the dark for years. They don't create your depth, they reveal it. And once you've seen that part of yourself clearly, pretending it doesn't exist becomes impossible. That is the point of no return. Not because the world changes overnight, because you do. Quickly, irreversibly. From that moment on, every choice carries a different weight, not because life becomes harder, because it becomes more honest. You begin choosing what aligns instead of what merely feels familiar. You stop chasing certainty and start respecting clarity. You stop asking whether you are ready and start asking whether you are being truthful. Those questions reshape a life, not all at once, one decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one quiet act of courage after another. And somewhere along that path, you realize something unexpected. Peace was never waiting at the end of the journey. It was growing inside every step you took with integrity. So this isn't an ending. It isn't a conclusion written to tie every loose thread together. Life doesn't move that way. There will be more questions, more moments that challenge everything you think you know, more encounters that reveal parts of yourself you haven't met yet. And that's exactly how it should be, because growth is not the absence of uncertainty, it's the willingness to keep walking through it without abandoning who you are. If there's one truth I want to leave behind, it's this: the most powerful transformations are almost invisible while they're happening. No audience applauds them. No headlines announce them. No one else may even notice. But one day you'll look back and realize the person who began the journey no longer exists. Not because they were lost, because they became someone who finally had the courage to live without hiding from their own truth. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle hidden inside every meaningful life. Not that we discover who we are in a single moment, but that, little by little, choice by choice, truth by truth, we become someone we no longer have to pretend to be. And when that day arrives, you won't need the past to explain you. You won't need fear to protect you. You won't need certainty to move forward. You'll simply continue. Not because every answer has been found, but because you've learned that an honest heart can walk confidently even through the unknown. And sometimes, that's the most complete ending any story could ever ask for.